I want a child from you, Isabella said. The words a blade slipped between his ribs, and Matteo felt as if the breath had been knocked from him by the blunt certainty of her voice. The candlelight threw her profile into a fierce, delicate relief, lips steadied, eyes like storm water. And for a flight of heartbeats, he forgot how to answer, because to answer was to sign away everything he had spent a life trying to keep: safety, anonymity, the memory of a brother taken for defiance. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. They sat in the library of the Lucero Philanthropic Wing, a room built to look like old power, a place where velvet met walnut and portraits watched like patient judges. Isabella's hands rested on the table between them. A ring glinted at the edge of her knuckle, not ostentatious but indisputable. Matteo's palms were clammy against the arms of his chair. He had come because the request had been framed as a medical consultation for a clinic the foundation was opening in the poorer quarter, a polite way to bring him into Lucero light without the usual parade of threats. He had not expected the confession to be a siege. He had treated men and women whose wounds had been paid for with silence. He had sutured guilt under his skin like a second uniform. He had never, until this moment, been asked to father a child by someone whose surname alone made men's knees go weak, whose father's voice could empty a bar and fill coffers with fear. "It's not a whim," Isabella said, and her voice was close now, a tremor she fought to hide. "Nor is it some caprice of rebellion. I cannot be, will not be, the vessel of my father's legacy. I want a life that calls me mother, and that child must not be written by Lucero law." Matteo saw the tremor and knew it was not merely self-willed bravery. He saw the lines near her eyes that no one in the society sheets ever noticed. The small calluses at the heel of her hand from gripping too long silks, from learning to steady herself against a legacy she had done nothing to earn and everything to inherit. He saw a woman who had learned diplomacy as armor and silence as a currency. He saw a plea dressed in the finest linens of danger. "You know what that will do," he said quietly. He did not shout. He had learned that his voice could not be louder than the pulse of fear beating in his own throat. "If you name me as the father, if anyone believes you, your father will want control. He will want to fold the child into his line. You know how he moves." Isabella nodded. "I know how he moves." She said it like a litany. "Which is why I cannot give him the child under his sign. Which is why I need someone who is separate, someone whose hands are clean in ways my father cannot touch." Clean. The word was a salt bite in Matteo's mouth. He had been a clean practitioner in a world that stained everything. He had refused once, years ago, when the Don had asked him to look the other way after an assault, refused to falsify a death certificate, refused to make a wound disappear from the paper. That refusal had cost him his brother. The Don had chosen a demonstration. A street had been made an example, and Matteo's brother had been taken on the logic of terror. Matteo carried the echo of that night like a fossil lodged near his heart. The brother's last breath, the slur of the Don's name like an authoritative verdict. "You would be a target," he said. "You would be everything he could use." "That's why the child must belong to you in name," Isabella replied. Her voice fell into a strange, practiced hush, as if delivering a verdict with surgical precision. "I cannot risk a Lucero heir. If the city thinks the child is yours, if the world writes Matteo Reyes into that ledger, my father will have no legal claim, no public acknowledgement. It would force him to leave us alone, or it would blunt him, at least publicly. Matteo thought of legalities and paperwork and how little those mattered under the weight of a Lucero temper. He thought of the secret men who watched his clinic at night, of heat-heated engines idling across the street, of the way fear had taught him to love at a distance. He thought of the brother he had lost to a choice he had made. He thought of the scab scarred across his soul. "You're asking me to lie," he said. It wasn't an accusation so much as a naming of the truth. To take a child into my life that is not mine, on paper. Isabella's laugh was a brittle thing. "You think I haven't considered not lying?" Her fingers found one of his, suddenly, an intimate theft, and the contact was an ignition. "I have considered every radical solution. I have thought of running, of birthing in some other country, of bribing medical staff until the record books no longer read my name. But I have also considered you, Matteo. You are the only man in this city whose conscience is a ledger that cannot be erased by payment. The only man who once stood up to my father and lived. You are the only man who is not owned." He wanted to tell her that living had not been living. He wanted to tell her that he lived in a series of small mercies and shuffling calculations designed to keep the threat from finding purchase on the ones he loved. He wanted to tell her that the night his brother had been taken, it had been because someone had thought him replaceable, because the Don wanted a lesson that would be remembered. To be named as her child's father would make him far from replaceable. It would tether him to a legacy he abhorred. "Why not?" he began, then stopped. He wanted to ask why she had come to him. A different man might have recognized the beauty, the power, the easy access to luxuries. He wanted to ask why she did not use one of the many men who would have said yes, because saying no to a Lucero daughter was hazardous employment. He wanted to ask why she had chosen the moral man whose hands had saved lives and whose conscience had cost him his brother. But the simpler truth hovered between them, because she wanted someone who would not become Lucero adjacent, because she wanted a father who could be a different kind of inheritance. "Because you are the only one whose hands are mine to trust," she said simply. "Because you lived after standing up to him, and that proves something to me, to my child." Matteo's reply was a small, bitter sound. He had lived as an act of stubbornness and fear. Survival had sometimes felt like an apology to the world. She was asking him to do more than survive. She was asking him to be visible in defiance, to be attached to a name that could open a door he had shut tight. The candle between them guttered as the evening draft found the room, and for a moment the light shivered across her face. In that flicker, he saw a childless woman who had practiced being invisible, who had tasted the blandness of public affection that meant nothing because it could be revoked by a single word from the Don. He also saw a lonely hunger that had nothing to do with power, the ache to be small inside someone's life, unrolled from the story that had been written for her. "You would ask me to be your shield," he said finally. Not with violence, he could not offer that. To take oaths I would not be able to keep if he came for me. Isabella's look hardened with an intensity that wasn't just fear. "This is not an offer for a shield, Matteo. It is a promise I'm asking of you, a promise to the child we would have, that their name will mean something other than fear. Whether you accept publicly or privately, that is the detail I'm willing to work out. What I need is your consent, your willingness to claim this life." There it was, the request laid bare, like a confession and a demand braided together. Matteo felt the world narrowing to the narrow place between promise and peril. If he said yes, he would be stripped of anonymity. He would be dragooned into the field of the Don's attention. His clinic might be burned, his friends threatened for association. Unknown men might show him how small the sum of his courage really was. If he said no, He would watch Isabella move toward whatever plan she adopted, and he would be left with a complex grief, the child he might have acknowledged and defended, and the unclean knowledge of having denied a woman whom he had slowly come to care for in dangerous, startled ways. He thought of the brother. He thought of the hollow where loving had once sat and been carved out by authority. He thought of the quiet, merciful patients who had trusted him with their bodies and had left their secrets in his keeping. "My life is not built for heroics," he said at last. It sounded like a confession and a warning. "I know how this will end in an ideal world, and then I go back to the night your father chose to teach me and pay for it with my brother's name." Isabella pressed her other hand over his. "I know the price," she said, "and I know nothing I can say will make it lighter. I only know that not having this child, not offering them a different naming, will feel like a betrayal to myself. If you refuse, I will do something else. I will find a way, Matteo. I will make choices that I cannot take back." The room seemed to contract around those last words. There was a fierce, helpless light in her eyes, one he recognized as the same spark that had allowed her to climb silently and deftly through the halls of a house built by men. He understood then that she had been measuring the risk as precisely as she measured a diplomatic speech. She could run, she could hide, she could bribe, she could force custody into forms. But each of these was a fork that might stab her child in another way. "So you're giving me the ultimatum and the sen," Matteo murmured. "Either I claim your child and share your danger, or you carve out a path that will make me complicit by absence." Isabella's jaw set. "I am giving you the chance to stand beside me," she said. "I am giving you the choice to be a father to this child in a way that means they won't start life with my father's shadow stamped on their forehead." The air between them was taut with unspoken history, with the loom of long-term consequences. Matteo felt the clock of his life tick audibly, as if the walls were closing in, compelling him to decide. He had never been asked to play a role so raw and irrevocable. He had never been asked to sign his life to an act of love that was also an act of political clarity. He had been a man who lived in steps, one patient, then the next, one small kindness, then the next, one refusal that cost dearly. The question now was whether he could take a step that would not be measured only in survival, but in daring. And then, with a swiftness that nearly stole his breath, Isabella said the thing that made the world tilt. "Matteo, I'm not asking you to be a saint. I'm asking you to be my child's father. If you refuse, I will not blame you, but I will keep you in my life whether you consent or not, because I need someone who remembers what it means to have a conscience. I need someone who will teach my child that a name can mean more than fear." He could have walked away in that second. He could have taken the clean route the rest of his life offered, small, safe, full of avoidance. Instead, he sat for a long breath and looked at the woman whose family had the city in its pocket, and whose own hand felt like a tether to something he had not yet named. Hope, perhaps? Foolishness, perhaps? Or the beginning of something that would demand the courage he had not known he owned. Outside the library, in the wing that was both sanctuary and stage, lights bloomed in the rain like small conspiracies. He could have insisted on clarity, demanded time, forced a safer interval. But something in the way Isabella looked at him, the way she trembled but did not look away, made the choice sharpen into something immediate. "I need to know one thing," he said, his voice low and steady. "Are you pregnant?" Her eyes fluttered, and the answer she gave him was not one that left room for mere negotiation. It was the moment when strategy hardened into reality, and when Matteo realized that the dilemma was no longer theoretical. "Yes," Isabella said, And the one-syllable answer landed like a verdict and a benediction at once. Her hands tightened on his as if to anchor herself to something real. The room spun on a pivot that did not belong to them. Matteo felt it physically, as if the floor beneath his feet had shifted and he were unmoored. 2 months. Not a plan, not a possibility, an actual life stirring inside her. The knowledge reframed everything with brutal immediacy. There would be time constraints, medical facts, the need for certainty and discreet care. There would be a date someone could mark on a calendar and a body someone could question. Her revelation made the danger with which she had toyed into a moving thing. Isabella's voice lowered, made smaller by the gravity of it. "I did not tell my father," she said. "I could not. He would decide for me, and I will not let him decide for this." His knuckles ached where her fingers had found his, the pressure of need impressing a print into his skin. He thought of the first time he had held a newborn in his hands. A cold little fist, a surprised squeal, the smell of vernix and milk, the absolute, punishing smallness of a new life. He thought of the way his brother had once laughed when something in the street had been absurd, the warm ripple of it that had made the world bearable. He thought of the way that laugh had been extinguished by an act designed to prove a point. "You should get medical care," he said, the physician surfacing through the fear like a buoy. "At once. Prenatal tests, an ultrasound. We need to know." He stopped. To know might also be to prove what she had told him in the private geography of their chairs. To know might be to add evidence that could be used as leverage for either side. "I have a midwife," she said, "old Marta. She has been with the household in useless ways for theater and grace, but she is good and careful and keeps her mouth like a granite wall." There was a touch of irony in her voice that made him smile despite himself. "She will do the first scans, but I will need a doctor I can trust. That's why I asked you to meet me under the pretense of the clinic." Matteo swallowed. Trust, a word luminous enough to make him tremble. He could not imagine bringing her into his clinic with its modest lamps and threadbare reception chairs. To do so would invite inquiry. He also could not imagine sending her into someone else's hands. The city that watched Lucero move did not blink kindly at those who crossed the Don's daughter. "If we proceed," he said slowly, choosing language like a surgeon does a blade, "we will have to be meticulous. No paper trail, no hospital births under your name. A midwife's record can be controlled. I will help with the examinations, where I can, off the books. But if this becomes public in the wrong way, if your father suspects, the risk will not just be yours." Isabella smiled, which was small and breathtaking. "I know," she said. "I know the cost." "That is why I asked you, Matteo, because you know how to keep things hidden without lying to the people who need the truth. You are careful. You are quiet. You have a history of doing what is right even when it hurts. That means—" She hesitated, then added, "It means I trust you." The word trust stuck to him like rain. He had been trusted by patients desperate for silence, by nurses who had slipped him confidences in the corridor. None of those trusts had the certain vulnerability of the one that now warmed his palm. He felt the room bend toward a new axis. Two people, formerly separate by a canyon of advantage and fear, now bound by a secret that was also a tenderest thing. They agreed on the logistics with the brittle clarity of two people making maps of danger. Marta would perform an initial exam. Matteo would follow with a private ultrasound in a rented room a few neighborhoods away. Neutral ground, no connection to his clinic. Isabella would tell the household only that she was ill when she needed to be absent. He would take the results and keep them in a lockbox behind his own heart. The plan read like a poem of avoidance and love. In the days that followed, the intimacy between them grew like a vine finding crevices. They met in borrowed rooms, in the shadowed corners of museums where the docents paid more attention to their patrons than their names, and in the quiet of his rented apartment where the city noise muffled any thought of the Don's reach. They navigated a strange choreography, Isabella learning to be less encased in etiquette, Matteo learning to let someone else close enough to see the rawness beneath his careful face. Their conversations were Spartan at first, a kind of rehearsal for courage. He told her pieces of his past, like fragments he could stitch into a garment without losing himself. The night his brother had been taken, the long months of silence he had answered with work and the building of an ethic that resisted complicity. Isabella offered memories that had not been gossip. A small balcony where she had once wept alone as the city lights blinked like distant watchfires. A childhood intimacy with a piano that had been sequestered in a room seldom visited. The first time she had understood that her name was an instrument as much as an identity. Evenings dissolved into confessions. Under the thin lamps of his kitchen, they cooked. Hers was a clumsy dance of etiquette and rebellion. His a professional steadiness that turned recipes into rituals. They touched in the small ways of those who build trust. A slipped hand over a back, a palm finding a shoulder during an anxious read of an ultrasound reading, an urgent, wordless squeeze when the news of a clinic near his turned up burned out from arson. But for every tender thread they wove, a new worry unfurled elsewhere. Rumors were the weeds of a city like theirs, quick, invasive, whispering. Matteo found a folded note outside his door one morning, a single line of handwriting he recognized only by its bluntness. The note read, "Stop playing with fire." This was not a direct threat. It was a taut chord struck under his feet, a reminder that the Don's influence was deployed not always by horns and burials, but by the ripple of intimidation. He burned the note the same day and did not tell Isabella. She noticed nonetheless the way his jaw tightened whenever his phone buzzed, the way his sleep thinned. When she confronted him, wanting to be the braver of the two for once, he lied. It was nothing, he said, a patient perhaps. The lie lodged between them with a cool, insignificant hurt. Then a new obstacle arrived, in the shape of a smiling man named Javier, a Lucero lieutenant who claimed to run charitable fronts and actually ran the surveillance for the family. He showed up at one of Isabella's fundraisers, like a hawk in a velvet vest, his presence a fissure of intent. Isabella's face did not betray anything, but Matteo watched her body go immediate and trained, the same posture she took in diplomatic meetings where her father's allies debated the fate of neighborhoods. Javier's questions were cloying in their casualness. "And you, Dr. Reyes," he said in a voice made for corridors, "what an honor to have your name attached to the foundation. Tell me, what would you advise a young woman in Isabella's position? A maternal angle, perhaps?" He smiled in a way that suggested he thought he already owned many answers. Matteo's reply was measured. "Support, always support," he said, "and the kind of care that women need, privacy, dignity, and good advice." The words were true in one sense and evasive in another. Javier's eyes held a light that made Matteo think of a hand closing over a map. He left with the soft click of a boot on tile, and the echo of his laughter felt like the scraping of sandpaper across trust. Isabella did not tell him if she had felt the same tension. She told him the same story in different places. Of an afternoon the Don had taken a child's toy because it symbolized a sliver of independence. Of a cousin married off to a stranger under the guise of alliance. Her voice never betrayed that Javier's interest landed in her lap like a small bomb. Their meetings continued. They learned each other's rhythms in the tenderest, most dangerous way. How Matteo's eyes narrowed when he thought of a decision. How Isabella's lips curled slightly when she considered leverage. They argued about less urgent things, the best place to secure a midwife's records, the ethics of forging a birth certificate should the need arise, until the arguments themselves became a map to a trust deeper than either had expected. One night, after a day that had delivered a catalog of minor threats, a man parked too long outside his clinic, a call asking after an old friend's whereabouts, Isabella came to Matteo's apartment with rain in her hair and a note of exhaustion under her measured poise. She sat on his couch and watched him move around his small kitchen with a domesticated grace. He poured wine as if it were a ceremonial act. "You are not like men I've known," she said finally, when the pause between them had stretched long enough to be a space for truth. "You ask what you can fix rather than what you can take. You are a dangerous sort." The last word was a half-tease, half-claim. He looked up at her and saw something soft that had not been there 2 months prior, a weariness no costume could conceal. "Isabella," he said, voice low, "dangerous men are not always the ones who raise guns. Sometimes they raise expectations and never lower them. I try to be honest about my limits." She moved closer, the distance between them folded into a gesture like a promise. Her hand brushed his cheek, and the contact was a small electric shock. "Then tell me your limit," she whispered. "Tell me where you will not go." Matteo could have whispered back a litany of reasons for no: fear, prudence, the echo of his brother's absence. But the truth that had been building like a tide in him pushed him past the line he had drawn in the sand of his life. He had not planned to step into a struggle for a child with a woman who could command a room simply by lowering her eyes. He had not planned to open his heart to the daughter of the man who had taken his brother. But in the decisive hush of that living room, with rain tattooing the windows and the city distant and indifferent, he heard a different imperative, the quiet, stubborn insistence of a conscience that had always been his north. "I can stand beside you," he said at last. "If you need me to claim the child publicly, I will do it. I have nothing to inherit but a name and the work of my hands. If taking this name will teach your child a different kind of legacy, then I will be that instrument." Isabella's face crumpled with a relief so fierce it looked almost like pain. For a moment she laughed, an absurd, fragile sound, then laid her head against his chest as if she had been granted refuge. He wrapped his arms around her as if he could shield her from consequences neither of them fully understood. They did not know then how the world beyond their rented apartment was already beginning to conspire. They did not know that Javier would speak into a glassy telephone and that the Don would tilt his head, hearing a name and feeling a loose thread. They did not know that by choosing each other, hesitantly, courageously, imperfectly, they had set in motion a set of reactions like dominoes arranged by an unseen hand. For now, there was only the hush of small intimacies, a touch, a whispered plan, the careful choreography of two people rehearsing a life that had not yet arrived. They slept in the same bed that night for the first time, the city outside indifferent, and the storm finally spent. In the dim hours, Matteo woke to find Isabella awake beside him, her palm tucked against the soft curve of her belly, a tiny, impossible cradle. "Promise me one thing," she murmured. He turned his face to hers. "What?" "That if things get ugly," she said, "you will not let me face them alone. Not as the Don's daughter, not as a secret steward of a child, but as a woman who chose to love you into this world." He could have made a conditional promise. He could have hedged with all the cautions that had framed his life. Instead, the weight of the small hand on her stomach, the memory of his brother's laughter, and the ache that had become for him a kind of teacher all conspired to make him answer plainly. "I promise," he said, and the word was small, fierce, and entirely uncalculated. Dawn found them with the same fragile hope and new lines of worry drawn across their faces. Outside, the city resumed its rhythms. Markets opening, the dawn's drivers brushing past curbs, men on motorbikes threading through alleys. In the Lucero house, the portrait of the dawn watched the events unfold with a face like weather. Javier would speak. Someone would notice the extra hours Isabella was absent. The midwife would keep her mouth like granite, but granite could crack under pressure. They had sealed a vow between them. They had also scribed their names on a ledger that would be read by those whose imaginations were built on control. The choice had been made, and with it came the first fracture. News that the Foundation Gala, one of the Dawn's favorite displays, would be advanced by a week. A decision that struck at the heart of their carefully carved time. Isabella now had less space to plan. Mateo's window to prepare had narrowed into a razor-thin line. Under the weight of the looming gala, with the Dawn's eyes likely to sweep any deviation like a hawk, their newly forged intimacy would be tested. Mateo found himself staring at a future scenario he had never considered. A public acknowledgement, a challenge to the Dawn's will, and the price of courage scraped raw on the altar of family and vengeance. The choice they had made to love was a small, bright rebellion, and it was only beginning to be noticed. The morning after the gala was moved, the city felt thinner, as if someone had peeled away an honoring skin and exposed the rawness beneath. Rain had stopped, leaving glistening tracks on the streets. Men walked faster, as if they could outrun attention. Mateo woke with the memory of Isabella's palm on her belly, but when he reached for the small lockbox where he kept the ultrasound print, his fingers met emptiness. For a sliver of a breath, he thought he'd dreamt it. Then the air thickened with a certainty that settled like frost. The ultrasound was missing. Not stolen with violence, no glass broken, no forced lock, but gone as if it had been folded into a clean, efficient erasure. He could hear the gentle, impossible choreography of a hand that had known where things were kept and how to take them without leaving the telltale tremble of alarm. The absence hurt like a bite. He called Isabella, and the line caught with static and then cut. He called Marta, who answered in a voice like flint, brief and brittle. "I saw no one, doctor. I did as you asked. All is as it should be." She did not ask for details. She did not volunteer them. Mateo felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Marta's granite might hold, but a granite that had been waiting for the right hammer could be split. When he went to his clinic, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and something else, fear warmed by the presence of men who did not belong. Two of his young volunteers sat at the reception, pale and tightly smiling, as if practice had made them professional at bluffing terror. They said nothing about the file that was no longer in the lockbox on his desk, a file that had contained his correspondence with Isabella, her appointment notes, the copy of the ultrasound. The hole it left was clean and clinical, like the incision of a surgeon who knows the exact shape to make. It did not take long for Javier's shadow to lengthen across Mateo's doorstep. The lieutenant visited in a manner that made every polite civility a form of threat. He complimented Mateo's work, mentioned the clinic's charity in the same breath he referenced Don Lucero's generosity. Then, with a movement of hand practiced to look casual, he dropped the question that felt less like curiosity and more like an instrument being set in place. "We all want what's best for a pregnant woman, doctor," Javier said, his smile a varnish. "We all want the child to be safe. Surely that is a universal aim." Mateo answered as he always did, measured, careful, but he felt the chair figuratively tilt beneath him. Outside, two men idled in a car that no one could link to the Lucero household. Inside, Javier's presence was a sieve for secrets. That afternoon, a package arrived at Mateo's clinic. A single photograph, glossy, of Isabella stepping from a private car the night of a small harbor. Her coat caught in the strut of a flash, the background blurred into suggestions of men in suits. Someone had been following her. On the back of the photograph, scrawled in a serif hand, was "Watched." Mateo's first impulse was to throw the photograph into the sink and drown it in bleach. His second was to run to Isabella and demand answers. He did both. He burned the photograph in his sink and went to the Lucero philanthropic wing like a man moving through water. Isabella saw him before he arrived at the door. She stood in the hallway like a statue, posed to anticipate grief, her face a carefully composed thing. When she opened the door to him, he could see the tremor again at the edges of her control. "They've noticed," she said without preamble. Her voice was not surprised. No, it was weary, in the way of someone who has practiced consternation until it becomes a utility. "My father called an emergency study group about the Foundation's security. He sent Javier to speak for public reassurance. They've been following me for weeks." "You did not tell me," Mateo said, and there was hurt in it that had nothing to do with protocols. It was the kind of small betrayal that grows heavy. Not telling him made him the ignorant party in a game he'd already vowed to join. "I told you when I thought I could control it," she said. "But control is an illusion, Mateo. Do you think I can simply hide a pregnancy in this house forever? I have been measured against the space of my father's ambitions for my whole life. Every absence is examined. Every whisper is a threat." "How will this change things?" Mateo asked, testing the surface for cracks. She looked at him as if measuring him for a suit he might not want to wear. "My father is suspicious of any deviation he cannot own. If he believes I have been patched into some other man's life, he will either erase the possibility by seizing custody of the child, or he will force a marriage to someone of his choosing who will bear the name he wants to be carried forward. He will not brook what he perceives as a betrayal. Or he will send you somewhere quiet," Mateo added, "a convent, another country. Or worse," Isabella said. "He will make an example of someone either in my household or in yours to show what rebellion costs." The announcement was a stone dropped in a still pool. Mateo thought of the night his brother had been taken and felt for the first time in months the hot flash of that memory like grief newly opened. He realized with a terrifying clarity that their secret was not static. It was a target. That evening, Don Lucero requested Isabella at dinner. The house was a theater of glinting cutlery and faces that learned the skill of neutrality. Mateo did not go. He could not imagine sitting beneath the portrait of a man who would weigh him by the measure of threats. Isabella sat at the table like a queen on a precarious throne. When she stood, she was bigger than the room expected her to be. "What has my daughter been up to?" Don Lucero asked, his voice sanded to civility but with an undercurrent like engines idling. Isabella met his eyes, and for a moment the room held its breath. She had the bearing of someone who had rehearsed defiance a dozen different ways. She chose a posture that combined stubbornness with the faint, shrewd humor of a woman who had been practiced in negotiation. "I have been preparing for the Foundation's clinic," she said. "I have also—" She paused, then dropped the small stone. "I am pregnant." The statement made a sound in the room, like a dish struck. Mateo felt it as if from across a gulf. The choice had left the safety of their private maps and been set down like a gauntlet. Eyes turned, and for the first time he felt the weight of the name Lucero as not only a family but a public force. Murmurs skated like frightened birds across table linen. Don Lucero's face did not change at first. Then, as if watching an insect, he tilted his head. "Is the father?" His voice was both a query and a threat carved into velvet. Isabella's face was a sea that calmed then broke. "Not under your name," she said. "I will not have your name." "You will do what I say," he cut in, slow and cold. His veiled threat had the clarity of law. "You are my daughter. You owe me not secrecy, but inclusion. You owe me heirs who will understand their place." "You owe me none of that," she said, and the defiance was quieter than the room expected. "You owe me the right to my own child." The thunder in the room was not loud. It was the tiny, absolute sound of consequences being set. Don Lucero's smile returned like an instrument of weather. "If you are indeed pregnant," he said, "then the family will take a measured approach. We will ensure the child belongs to the house. We will—" "You will not decide for me," Isabella interrupted, and in that instant something fractured. Matteo felt a tearing sensation inside his chest, as if an invisible seam in their plan had been split. He was not there to hold the seam together. Outside the wing, Javier watched from the brokered shadows, the sort of man bred to note the faintest crack in armor. He had already made his call. The picture of Isabella had traveled. The Don had the luxury of legal channels, of alliances, and of henchmen who did not need to carry banners to mark their ownership. That night, his clinic was firebombed. It happened in a way that announced cowardice and precision. A single canister, flung through a back window, exploded into heat that gutted paper and sterilized equipment, leaving the echo of a room where people had once trusted someone with their bodies. No one was harmed. The volunteers escaped. But the smell of smoke is a balm in the mind of a physician. The sense that a place where life is tended can become a place of violence. Matteo watched his work burn with a taste like metal in his mouth. His hands, the hands that had stitched wounds closed and kept confidences, were useless now. He saw in the flames the shadow of a hand that would not let him fold away again. He understood, with a clarity that made blood sing in his ears, that this was not only about the clinic. It was about fear being taught by destruction. Isabella arrived at the gutted building with a face like thunder. She ran her palm across charred tiles as if trying to read a map from the ruin. "You should have left it alone," she said, not angry at him, but at the reality that had been forced into being. "You should have been smarter." "I tried to be honest," he said, voice ragged. "I promised to be visible." "You promised me a father for my child," she said, "not a martyr." The line between them, once braided with trust, now ran raw. They stood amid the smoking relics of care and felt an atmosphere that was equal parts accusation and grief. For the first time since their pact began, the conversation they needed to have was impossible to ignore. Was Matteo's visibility a shield or a spur? Had his choice brought the Don's wrath to a place that had nothing to do with them except the fact of his name on it? That night, as rain came again and washed smoke into the gutters, Isabella and Matteo argued, not about logistics, but about consequence. She accused him of naivete. He accused her of hubris. Both accusations were true and incomplete. Words like betrayal and protection tumbled into the room, heavy and childish in equal measure. When Matteo left the Lucero wing that night, he did not go to his apartment. He went instead to a hospital on the other side of the river, to a ward where names were dice-rolled and lives anonymized. He sat in the quiet until dawn stole in and he realized he had finally measured what he might lose. He wanted to run. He wanted to stand. He wanted to be small and safe, and also impossibly large, with the courage to love Isabella as she had asked. The choices calcified in the new light, and Matthew understood that fractures were not only the breaking of things, but the making of new shapes. Isabella, in her rooms within the Lucero house, walked the corridors like a woman who had been given the impossible option between giving in and giving birth. Don Lucero called her into his study the next afternoon. She went without protest, but her hands trembled only once, when the portrait of the Don seemed to look down with a patience that was a kind of verdict. "You have put my house in turmoil," Don Lucero said, deceptively soft. "You have made public circles worry. I can manage scandal, Isabella, but I will not have a child torn from me by rumor." "What do you want me to do?" she asked, not pleading but bearing the bone of practicality. "Marry," he said, and the word fell like a net. "To someone who will ensure the lines are not frayed. You will marry a man of our choosing. You will raise your child within our protection. You will not be an errand into someone else's conscience." Isabella's breath came, thin and hurt. "I will not marry to save appearances," she said. He smiled then, the smile of a man working the last card. "Then you will lose everything, child. You will lose comfort, position, and the protection one provides. You will be watched until you lay your child at our feet, or you will be taken elsewhere where no one will know how to find you." The ultimatum was heavy as a law. It left no room for the people who loved with messy, imperfect courage. It forced Isabella into a calculus she had avoided, the child she wanted to keep from her father's legacy, or the life she had been bred to accept. When she left the study, her face was unreadable, and for a long time she did not reply to Mateo's messages. When they finally met, in the space between his ruined clinic and her gilded prison, the distance between them was as much distance as a language could carry. The fractures had widened into chasms, trust strained, safety vanished, and the child, small and unknowing, was the fulcrum upon which all their choices now balanced. They clung to each other badly in the days that followed, each trying to patch what was broken with things that could not hold. Mateo's anger at the donor of threats, Isabella's fury and fear at her father's ultimatum. Javier's surveillance turned more pointed. Marta's granite silence grew brittle under the pressure of men offering her coin. The city watched and whispered like a crowd waiting for a performance, and neither Mateo nor Isabella could tell if they were actors or victims. Secrets multiplied, a ledger with names, the man who had been paid to take photographs, the donor list for the gala that had been moved for reasons that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with control. Each secret, when exposed, rent another portion of the delicate fabric they were trying to sew. In the center of the rending, the child in Isabella's belly thudded like a small insistence, an argument in itself that someone belonged to a future no one had the right to commandeer. It would not be a single fracture that broke them. It would be the accumulation, mistrusts, choices made out of fear, the slow realization that loving across a gulf carved by power requires not only courage but also allies the size of nations. And in that slow accumulation, they learned the most dangerous truth, that sometimes, to protect what you love, you must allow it to hurt you first. They chose confrontation because the city already knew them as cowards. There was no honor in hiding further. The gala, once a glittering stage for Don Lucero's benevolence, became the only place where light could be trained on a secrecy he preferred in shadow. Isabella sent a single messenger to Mateo that morning. "Come, be seen. No scripts. Meet me there when the music turns." Mateo dressed as if he were going to his own funeral. A dark suit that had been pressed in private, a small white handkerchief folded with the same care he had once given to the bandages on a child's wound. His hands shook before he reached the Lucero wing. He thought of his brother with that peculiarly private grief that refuses to be mollified, and he thought of the small life steadying inside Isabella. That was his star now, not the memory that taught him how to fear. Isabella entered the hall like a woman stripped of airs. No jewelry larger than necessary, no entourage, just a composed gait and a face that had learned to translate brittle courage into equilibrium. When she saw Matteo in the half-light near the orchestra, something like a softening took the edge off her fear. She crossed to him without ceremony. "If this ends in flames," she said, the whisper a confession as much as a plan. "Do what you must to keep our child safe." He could have answered with protest, with protocols, with fear. Instead, he held her hand and felt the small certainty of her pulse beneath his palm, alive, steady, demanding. "Then let the truth be the fire we choose," he said. They did not have allies in print. They had Marta and a handful of quietly loyal faces who had been paid little but believed in the sanctity of life. Marta stood in the wings like granite, a midwife turned witness with records folded into an envelope and an anger at injustice that had been slow to kindle and ferocious when lit. Together, they walked into a room curated to flatter a man's power and turned it into the theater of a reckoning. The orchestra played a veiled strain as Don Lucero rose to give a small, practiced speech about charity and legacy. He did not expect to be interrupted. He did not expect the gentle, impertinent hand of Isabella to lift and the hush to descend on the 100 plates and 100 polished knives. "Father," she said, voice steady and carrying more than the room measured for her, "before you speak of legacy, I must speak of someone else's." The Don's smile hardened like the edge of a coin. His eyes flicked to Matteo with the cool appraisal of a judge who had met many defendants and found them wanting. Javier, stationed by the doorway, moved like a sentinel, too obvious, too late. Matteo stepped forward, every breath a negotiation with fear. "I am Matteo Reyes," he said plainly, and the name in that room felt like a small detonator. "I am the father of Isabella's child." The gasp that passed around the hall was a current in a still pond. Conversations stalled. Forks clinked against plates like wind through chimes. Don Lucero's expression tightened. "You presume," he said, smooth as oil, "to use my name against me." "No, Don Lucero," Matteo replied. "I use the truth. Your name has been used to men obey by fear. I am asking that your daughter and our child be allowed to exist without being catalogued as an asset." Isabella's face was a crucible of courage. She stood 2 breaths behind him, and in those 2 breaths the room could have raised or raised them both. "My father," she said, addressing both their histories and his capacity to command, "I name this child's father because I will not have fear handed down as an heirloom. Matteo will be the child's father in the public record. He will stand with me." For a moment, a very dangerous moment, Don Lucero's control looked like it might snap. He could have seized them out of the room, made an example. He could have delivered the kind of punishment the city whispered about in corners. Instead, he measured the currency in a different coin: optics. "My daughter," he said slowly, "you have made a spectacle." "I have made a life," Isabella answered, and the contrast in the room was as sharp as a blade. Matteo saw it then, the levers of power flexing and choosing preservation over ruin. To drag this into violence would invite an inquiry that could unseat reputations and draw eyes to deals Lucero preferred to keep in oil and silk darkness. A scandal might infect alliances. It might fracture donors. The Don's empire was built on the assumption that fear kept people compliant, but it also relied on appearances that softened hard deals into a social contract. Matteo, with nothing but a conscience and a name that meant little to the men of influence, became suddenly a political calculation. Still, he could not expect mercy. He stepped closer to Don Lucero and offered something the man could not be taught to read, a bargain that was neither supplication nor machination. "If you would rather remove me than admit a child whose father does not carry your name," Matteo said, voice low, "then take me. Take whatever punishment you choose, but take me in front of witnesses. No private vanishing, no excuses. If you hurt me in secret, then we lose only a life. If you hurt me in the light, the city will watch and judge." The room inhaled. Isabella's fingers tightened on his sleeve like a promise to themselves. Don Lucero, who had learned to win by removing possibility, paused. He liked control too much to hand over a spectacle, yet he hated shame worse. He could counter by buying silence, by offering a marriage to contain risk. But he saw at once that the cost of buying silence from a man like Matteo would be high in currency the world that funded his charities could not stomach. There was another turn possible. Don Lucero could accept a public claim that did not destabilize his men. Acknowledge Matteo as the father in a statement that would be begrudging but manageable. Permit marriage or protection arranged by the family, and thereby keep the scandal from curdling into investigation. This was a piece of expediency, not of justice, but it would preserve the Don's empire and ensure the child lived publicly without being immediately turned into a trophy. He smiled, slow, practiced. "Matteo Reyes," he said, and the syllables landed as if collecting tax. "If you choose to attach yourself to my daughter and my grandchild, you will have the family's protection and the obligations that come with such a name. You will be known, and knownness is a leash as much as it is a shield." Matteo thought of his brother's last breath and felt the old hollow gape like a wound. He could have demanded exile, a private triumph that left him safe but hollow. Instead, he saw the only conceivable path to keep the child free, accept the visibility, accept the leash, and convert it into a different kind of protection. "I accept," he said. The word was not surrender, it was an offering. "I accept the publicness, the obligations. I will be known, if that means the child will not be hidden behind your shadow." Isabella released a breath that might have been a sob, and her laughter, brief, almost a prayer, spilled out. Marta stepped forward then, handing an envelope to a waiter who carried it to the podium with ceremonious gravity. Inside were the midwife's records, verified and detailed, and a sealed statement that attested to Isabella's pregnancy and the dates. The room could now not claim ignorance. Don Lucero tilted his head, the calculation running in a face that had prized dominion over kinship. He weighed the cost of making Matteo an enemy against the cost of letting the city witness his inability to control his own house. Power, he understood in that glinting instant, sometimes required flexibility. Power that could not adapt ended as rumor in the gutter. "You have made your choice," he said at last to both of them. "Then you will wear the consequences. You will be part of this house in ways you do not yet understand." Matteo felt the offer as both a cage and a lifeline. He would be watched, limited, perhaps used. But the child would be born into a world where the father's name was not a cipher for fear. Isabella's hand on his arm trembled, not because she feared what would come, but because she recognized the cost he had accepted. Later, when they stepped from the hall into the rain that had begun like a cleansing, Isabella laid her forehead against Matteo's and whispered, "Were you afraid?" "I was," he said simply, "and I am, but less of what I was before." She smiled then, and the sound was full and fierce. "We both made a sacrifice," she said. "I gave the chance to hurt you by naming you. You gave yourself to the world." He kissed her knuckles, the smallest of sanctifications. "We did it for a child," he said. That is more than some kings do. Behind them, in rooms where deals were folded like money into wallets, Javier frowned and plotted, and Don Lucero, for the first time in a long while, had to write a new ledger, one that accounted for a risk he could not, without cost to himself, erase. For Mateo and Isabella, the day offered no promises of safety, only a precarious, luminous claim. They had reclaimed the right to name a life. In doing so, they had stepped into the light together, ready to face whatever shadow might fall. The weeks that followed were an awkward, fragile apprenticeship in keeping a life that belonged to two people amid a family that believed itself to own everything. Don Lucero kept his distance with an artful, watchful cool. His concessions came wrapped in conditions and 100 small instructions, but he did not undo what had unfolded in public. The city, which loved scandal like sunlight, turned instead toward a quieter curiosity: how this odd, moral man would wear a name he had not been born to. Mateo wore it like a new garment, stiff at first, edges cutting where he had never expected to be cut, but he learned to turn with it. Isabella learned to take up space that had always been rationed to her, folding power into tenderness, not spectacle. There were days of grace threaded through the guardrails of vigilance. They learned the infant rhythms of the life to come, which foods made Isabella's stomach rebel, what lullaby Mel used to hum in the nursery corridors, the particular way the child kicked when a brass band rehearsed in the plaza 2 blocks over. The child was an insistence, a steadying drumbeat that made their fear less abstract. They decorated a room in the Lucero wing in the hush of after hours, choosing colors as if naming a future. Soft ochres and sea glass greens, a place where the child's breathing would one day be a small, ordinary miracle in a house that had been taught to demand extraordinary things. Not all wounds healed. Mateo still woke sometimes from a dream with his brother's laughter threaded through it, as if the city kept one chair empty in his heart. Isabella still bore the habit of looking over her shoulder, of measuring philanthropy for its cost. They argued over trivialities that became large in the small hours, over whether to accept help from a Lucero trustee who smiled like a ledger. But the arguments were honest, anchored in a mutual claim that had been paid for with fear and chosen with love. When the child came, a rustle of a new name, a small, surprised cry that turned both of them toward a future. The delivery was quiet, watched by Marta's steady eyes and a handful of allies who had kept faith. Mateo held Isabella's hand and felt the world contract and expand in the same breath. He did not see reprisal in the faces around him. He saw the astonishment of people who have been offered something they did not expect, the possibility that love could be a form of defiance and also a shelter. They named the baby for a street where Mateo's brother had once laughed, a small private memorial sewn into a common name. The child's first breath was a benediction that could not be seized by threats or purchased by intimidation. In the weeks after, Don Lucero sent no men to take away what had been publicly named. He watched, privately rearranging his holdings to accommodate a truth he could not erase without breaking his own facade. Perhaps he understood, in the slow arithmetic of power, that some costs are too dear to inflict when the city watches. On a late afternoon, months into a new ordinary, Mateo stood on the small balcony of the Lucero wing with the child asleep against his chest, wrapped in a thin blanket the color of riverstone. Isabella joined him with 2 cups of tea and stood a little behind him, as if respecting the new pattern of their family. The city hummed below, vendors calling, the distant staccato of traffic, but here, above the noise, there was a quiet like a shared secret. "Do you ever regret it?" Isabella asked softly, handing him a cup. He looked down at the sleeping face, small nose, a ridge of dark hair like a brushstroke, and thought of every danger that had bled into their year. He thought of his brother's ghost and of the cost they had both paid to disentangle one life from another's shadow. "No," he said finally, "not in a way that matters." He sipped the tea, felt it steady him. "I am scared, I am tired, but when I hold this—" He tapped the child's shoulder, where a tiny hand had curled and relaxed in sleep. "I understand the kind of bravery I can be." Isabella leaned her head on his shoulder and breathed him in like a promise. The portrait of the Dawn remained on the wall inside, a presence that had learned to tolerate a small rebellion. Outside, the light shifted toward evening and gilded the city in the color of possibility. They did not imagine every danger had passed. They only knew the truth that the child had already taught them, that names could be changed, that fear could be met with tenderness, and that love, quiet, stubborn, imperfect, could be the most dangerous thing of all to those who expected obedience. Below, a street band began to play, a cheerful, ragged tune that wound up like a ribbon and drifted to their balcony. The baby stirred and murmured, and both parents laughed, a small, relieved sound that had the shape of survival. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment and pictured a future where a name meant nurseries and bedtime stories rather than ledgers and leverage. Matteo pressed a kiss to the child's crown and then to Isabella's hair, 2 benedictions in one. They were not free of shadows, but they were, together, learning the grammar of a new normal, that protection could be claimed as much by love as by power, that courage could be ordinary, and that a small human being might one day stand between a legacy of fear and the life they chose to teach. The city turned its faces in 100 directions, but on that balcony, in the last gold of day, Matteo and Isabella held their child like a trembling doctrine, and the world, for a moment, felt both dangerous and brilliantly, painfully salvageable.